I'm Mason Mount. You're listening to the London is Blue podcast.
I'm Pat Nevin.
Hi, this is Ruben Loftus-Cheek.
I'm Mason Mount. You're listening to the London is Blue podcast.
Welcome back, Chelsea fans, to another episode of the London is Blue podcast, your home for all things Chelsea FC. Dan, Mike, Nick, and myself cover all the match reviews from the latest Chelsea matches. We cover the team news and even throw you some exclusive interviews. Thank you already for being an awesome listener. And you know what? Let's jump right in.
All right, Chelsea fans, welcome back to another episode of the London is Blue podcast. We are doing our Premier League season preview specials, and on this episode, we are talking about last season's champions, the Centurions from 2 seasons previously, Manchester City, and we are so fortunate to be joined by David Mooney, at David Mooney on Twitter. He is the host and founder of the Blue Moon podcast, at Blue Moon Podcast on Twitter. David, welcome to the show, and how great is it right now to be a City supporter?
It's probably the best it's ever been, if truth be told. The funny thing with it is that there are City fans who, well, I mean, the vast majority of City fans can remember the worst ever period in City's history, and then for what is ultimately going to be the best ever period to be within living memory of that, it makes for a really weird setup, you know.
Yeah, definitely. It's much like I think how we felt once Abramovich came in, and we kind of ran this really long distance, and we're still winning trophies, but maybe not at the same clip that we used to. And I think City was kind of a few years after that, and just kind of where they started that basically run of success. And so I feel like City and Chelsea fans have a lot of similar understanding to what it can feel like when you understand the lows, so that you appreciate the highs a little bit more than some other clubs.
Yeah, were Chelsea's lows that low though? Really, recently? Because I
recently, no.
I was going to say when Abramovich arrived, you'd won things in the years before that, hadn't you? You'd won like FA Cups and stuff like that. So there was still success kind of around there. When Mansour arrived at City, it was 35 years without a major trophy that they went 76 to 2011, and Mansour arrived in 2008. So there'd been a long time where City were not at the top table and were not a powerhouse of English football. And there's a really weird, I don't want to get bogged down in the history of things already, but I think this is fascinating. In the early 90s, 1991-92, the last season before the Premier League, City finished above United, and they were both in a position where things could go either way. City, I think, finished 5th that year, and they were really in a position to kick on and develop and become a powerhouse of English football. United were in a pretty similar position, and then by 1999, City were in their lowest ever position in the football pyramid, and United were winning a treble. And it was just at that sliding doors moment where things just one went one way, one went the other. And for one, it just absolutely fell apart. So there was a point in the 90s where, if things had been a little bit different, then we could have been talking about City as one of the powerhouses of English football through the 90s and noughties, instead of it being United.
Yeah, it just took a couple extra decades to get there, but you're finally arrived, and you can enjoy that fact. So,
and a few £100 million, yeah.
Yeah, what's that to people who own entire states and sovereign nations? So. What about you, though? So how long have you been a City supporter? Kind of where did your love for the club really flourish? Is it all, from childhood to now, or did you kind of come to it later in life?
Yeah, it's not really a very interesting story. It's just my dad was a City fan. My mum and him used to take me to games when I was younger, and I was kind of indoctrinated at an early age. So, I don't buy into that whole, some fans are better than others, or, our fans are different than your fans and that sort of thing. I fully accept that I was brainwashed into it when I was a child and formed this deep emotional attachment to this football club for no other reason than my parents are particularly cruel for doing that to a 5, 6, 7-year-old kid in the mid-1990s when, the easier solution would have been at that time to go support United. So It's just simply that it kind of runs in the family. I think that we got free tickets through school. City used to give free tickets to the community, and my school was one of them that got free tickets. We applied for them and got them. And that's how we ended up kind of going to games. And then by about 96, 97, we realised that we were buying individual tickets to go to games pretty much every other week. So we may as well just get season tickets, and we've had season tickets ever since.
Oh, that's excellent. Well, I can definitely relate to the indoctrination piece from parents, and it's not necessarily as bad as a cult type of indoctrination at a young age. But I remember...
I'll take that. There are worse things to be indoctrinated into.
Yes.
I'll concede that.
I remember being raised as a Boston Red Sox fan in the early 90s, and then into the 2000s, finally getting a chance to see them win a World Series. And so after years of being heckled or made fun of by friends who were Yankees supporters, it was quite the transitionary moment. So, the comeuppance always returns for people.
It does, yeah.
So great. So let's kind of jump in. We'll kind of take a look at last season, how you feel about it, maybe what were the high or the, not as high moments, the arrivals and departures, anything that's been interesting there, how you're thinking about Chelsea and what's happened in this offseason for us, and then looking to the season ahead. So we'll go in last season. Obviously, you win the league, you win the FA Cup, you win the League Cup, you win the Community Shield, you make it to the quarterfinals of the Champions League. On a scale of, I would say 1 to 10, but I'm actually going to go like 8 to 10 probably. How would you rate the last season for City?
The thing is, it sounds awful to say this, but because of the way that scales work, 10 has to be the absolute perfect season, and 0 has to be the worst season imaginable. And although last season was the single best in City's history, and they played better football than anybody has ever seen them play before, it can't quite reach 10 because they weren't perfect. And but on that kind of flip side, you would say, well, no team could ever make 10 because you're never going to have the perfect season. So I reckon it was probably as close to perfect as you could really ask for. So you'd kind of give it 9.9, I reckon.
I think that's fair. I think most people would rate it that way. So I'm guessing that the biggest regret, though, this previous season, even after winning all that, is just the way that City went out of the Champions League. And that's probably the one area I would guess that you would hope there would be improvement in this coming season.
Yeah, the Champions League is... oh boy, there's a lot to unpack with the Champions League and City. They don't really get on. It's funny because the club's ownership and the management and the players will all be desperate to win the Champions League, and will all be really pushing for that to be the area of improvement. It's the only area in which they can improve next season. On a side note, it's a bit weird going into a season where your expectations for it are lower than what you achieved the year before. But you kind of, if you were to say next season would be a failure if City didn't do what they did last season, then you're setting them up for a fall because they're probably not going to do what they did last season. So when it comes around to the Champions League and you ask for a little bit of improvement in there, well, they've reached the semi-finals of the competition once. And in that year, they got lucky in many ways. They weren't playing well at all. It was Manuel Pellegrini's final season at the Etihad, and it was the year that Leicester won the title. And the biggest regret that I think Pellegrini will have in his managerial career at City is, first off, the way he went out of the Champions League that season, because they got to the semi-final, played Real Madrid, and they actually did really well to keep Madrid at arm's length in the home leg. They went away to the Bernabeu in the second leg and did absolutely nothing. And there was a point with kind of like 10, 15 minutes to go where they needed a goal. A goal would have taken them through to the Champions League final. And what Pellegrini did was just kind of sit on things and kind of keep it as it was, and they never really opened the taps and got going. And it kind of summed up that entire season. And on a kind of more roundabout way, it kind of sums up City's relationship with the Champions League as it is. The fans are quite apathetic towards it, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think the first one was when they first qualified, it was quite they were quite enthusiastic about it and quite excited to see City playing in the Champions League for the first time. For the first 2 or 3 seasons, they got drawn in a group that was ridiculously difficult, and for 2 of those draws, they had won the league the year before. So you kind of get. I remember it was in the 2012-13 season. They were in a group of 4 champions of their own domestic league. And yeah, okay, City had won the league the year before, and they should have performed better than they did in that group. You still also have to turn around and say, well, why did the team that finished 4th in England get an easier draw than the team that finished first? Where's the kind of reward for doing what City had done? And it was that, I think, that kind of sparked the reform of the Champions League seeding system for the group stage. So that happened, and then the first 3 or 4 years, City played really badly in the Champions League, and so fans started to think, well, why are we bothering getting up for this competition when they're going to turn up and not really play very well? And then on top of that, you throw in a few incidents with UEFA, the financial fair play charge, the idea that financial fair play was put in place as a very hasty way to stop City just spending loads of money and getting their way to the top table, which I've got opinions on, and we'll probably touch on a bit later on. There was an incident where Mario Balotelli and Yaya Toure were racially abused at, I think it was in Porto once they dropped down into the Europa League in that first season. And Porto were fined less than City were fined for arriving late to the second half of that game, and so there was a whole string of kind of things that have really gone towards making a massive fallout between City fans and UEFA. And now we've got to the stage where City fans are really not that fussed about the Champions League because everything has boiled over. And so City are in this really weird juxtaposition of the club wanting to improve and do well in the competition, and City fans just not getting up for it. I mean, you look at the group stage, and it's really difficult for City to sell tickets to it, because I think a lot of the fans recognise that those group games, there's not really a lot riding on them. City lost the first group game last season and still went on to walk the table and get into the knockout stages. So there's kind of not a lot of jeopardy there. As soon as the jeopardy kind of increases and you get to the knockout stages, and you look at that Tottenham game that City went out to, stadium was sold out. So you kind of get in this position where the exciting games are the ones where the fans will rock up to and do their bit for. But there's no real value in the early stages, especially when ticket prices are what they are. So there's a real kind of melting pot of problems with City in the Champions League. So to simply say that City need to improve in that next season to improve on it is a really weird sort of position to have, because I don't know if they can in the way that it's working at the moment.
Right. It sounds as almost if there's a need to combat the apathy within the supporters towards that competition and find a way for the club has to find a way to take their desire and help map that or bridge the divide, and where the supporters feel this, basically feel like they've been slapped around by UEFA enough and feel like Europe isn't as important, to the domestic success that City's had over the past few seasons, and bridge those two things together. And the two are not currently in sync.
They're very much not in sync, and I don't know how you solve the problem, to be honest. There's the other kind of issue with it as well is Guardiola doesn't seem to get why the fans feel like that, and I suspect that's because he's come from Barcelona and Bayern Munich, who have had masses of success in the competition, and so the fans are really on board with it. And I think the fact that City haven't had that success means the fans are still quite sceptical of it, and not and kind of. They don't have this rip-roaring atmosphere that you would expect at Barcelona and Bayern Munich. So pre-match, when in his press conferences, when he says things like "we need our fans to turn up and get behind the team," the fans' reaction to that is quite often, "Oh, you can't tell me what to do. Don't tell me what to do like that. I'll get up for the games that I want to get up for. Don't be. You might be bringing your great football here and winning all sorts of trophies, but you can't tell me what to do, sort of thing, when it comes to the Champions League." So there is a massive disconnect, and I suppose the short answer is I have absolutely no idea how you solve it other than winning the thing.
Well, that again, with the squad that's been assembled, I think that is obviously could happen, given the fact that we had All English Europa League and Champions League final this past season. But let's kind of dig into that squad in particular. So, in terms of departures, I think Fabian Delph going to Everton is one of the big money move that you guys made in terms of almost £10 million for selling him. Vincent Kompany obviously leaving after a very long time and tenure with the club. Any concern about who's left, in terms of filling void, or was it more of your feeling that it was age, it was the fact that the squad is extremely deep and that the opportunities is just kind of decreasing for players that are more in the fringe?
I'm not particularly worried about the state of the squad. It would be incredibly crass of me to say that City are going to struggle next season for players. I think, first off, there is a myth about City that they have a very deep squad. They don't. What they do have is a squad that is able to first off adapt to problems, and second off, they can all fill in for each other. So, for example, City, you look at City's squad on paper, and they don't have the required number of homegrown players, so they can't name a full 25-man squad. So I think the most they can name is 22 players, which again, it's not a huge problem. But then you throw in. Okay, Fabian Delph's left now, but he was one who could play in the centre of midfield, or he could play at left back, or he could fill in as a holding midfielder or a box-to-box midfielder, that sort of thing. And so what City have is a lot of players that can play in a lot of different positions. And so it feels like they have this great strength in depth, but suddenly when they get 4 or 5 injuries on the go at the same time, your fans look at it and go, "Well, goodness me, the squad is down to its bare bones." And it's this paradox that everything exists in, because actually, Guardiola is very, very good at solving those problems. When he hasn't got a left back, for instance, he is able to make one. He turned Fabian Delph into one for 2 years. Okay, last season didn't really work out for him. Alexander Zinchenko is not a left back, but then this season he will be one of City's 2 main left backs for the entirety of the campaign. So what Guardiola can do is he can look at a problem and then solve it with what he's got, and that's why he always seems very disinterested in transfers, for instance. Whenever transfer questions are put to him in press conferences, he kind of says, "Well, you know what? It's the director of football that sorts that out, and I just kind of coach the team and get the results on the pitch, sort of thing." And so I think when it comes down to am I worried about the squad? While Guardiola's in charge, I'm not going to be worried about who's around and who can fill in where. The number of times City have had problems with, there's no striker available this week because one's injured, one's suspended, so what's he going to do? And he's fiddled with things around, he's put Kevin De Bruyne up top, or he's moved Raheem Sterling into this kind of false 9 position, and it's worked. So there's so many options that he has. I think City's squad is well positioned to be able to kind of deal with that. The centre-back thing is interesting. They've lost, obviously, Vincent Kompany, who has moved on after 11 years at the club. It's going to be a really weird kind of squad to not have him in it anymore. But the feeling is that Fernandinho will be a centre-back next season, so that kind of balances that one out. And then Rodri comes in and takes Fernandinho's position in the team.
Sure.
There's also the added benefit that Ilkay Gundogan last season was someone who was, in the first half of the season when Fernandinho got injured, Gundogan couldn't do that role. In the second half of the season, the run into the title, City didn't have Fernandinho available for 4, 5, 6 games there, and Gundogan came in, did the perfect job, and went on to score on the last day of the season to. I think his goal put the game beyond doubt at Brighton. So there's so many different options that Guardiola has with the players he's got. I don't really feel like the club will go out and spend a lot of money unless it absolutely has to. Unless there was a position where three centre backs were suddenly injured, or one, or maybe Otamendi says, I need to play more games, I need to leave. Then they might go and replace him once they've got rid of him. But they're not going to do any major surgery, I don't think.
So you're not unhappy with the £80 million Harry Maguire acquisition for going to potentially United versus heading to City?
No, I wouldn't. Unless Otamendi were to leave, for instance, then I think City should look at their options. I think From what I've seen of Maguire, he's a very, very good defender, and he's done well for England. But I think he would probably accept that if he were to be coming to City, he would be behind John Stones and Aymeric Laporte. But then equally, Guardiola has this thing where when he picks his centre backs, he picks them for the opposition. He doesn't pick what his ideal starting pair would be. For most games, City fans would go, well, Stones and Laporte are your two starters, and you kind of build around that. For games last season where you had a big battering ram of a striker for the opposition, for instance, Guardiola would quite often pick Otamendi because he's someone who is quite up for the battle when maybe Stones and Laporte aren't quite that sort of defender. So he looks at who he's got available, and I think if Otamendi were to leave, you look at Fernandinho as a centre-back and then Laporte and Stones, they're all very similar. He might want to go out and get another battler at some point.
No, that makes sense. So, yeah, and then you did mention that Rodri's coming in to take over that defensive midfield position. Obviously he's probably the single big dollar signing that City will have this season. How do you think he's going to allow the team to maybe play a little bit differently? And what's your excitement level for him?
I think what's been exciting about him is that he has just turned up. He's played a couple of games in pre-season. He's looked like he's been here for 3 years. So the fact that he's comfortable on the ball and he seems to know what he's doing, I think that will put a lot of City fans at ease. Fernandinho has been irreplaceable for City in the last couple of years. You look at the defeats they suffered last season. The first defeat at your place at Stamford Bridge, it was going well. City were on top of the game. They conceded against the run of play, and I think it was in the move where they conceded the first goal, Fernandinho got injured, and the question was, are they going to take him off or leave him on? They left him on. And City, he couldn't impact the game, and from that point on, City never once looked like scoring. The following week, they played Crystal Palace at home. Fernandinho didn't play, and they found themselves 3-1 down with half an hour to go. The week after Boxing Day, they get to Leicester, and again Fernandinho not fit and not available. And they just don't have any threat whatsoever, and Leicester come in and it felt against the run of play watching the game, but also at the same time it felt like City could play and play for the whole of Boxing Day and never score. So you kind of say, well, Leicester deserve that one as well. Those three defeats in particular, City had a lot of the ball, but they did nothing with it. And I think what Rodri could offer is when Fernandinho isn't there, the ability to get the ball moving and find the dangerous players in dangerous positions that the other midfielders have not really been able to do. Okay, Gundogan was doing it again towards the end of the season, but he's someone who you kind of want arriving late in the box. He's not the sort of player that you want sitting deep and pulling the strings. So I think it'll be interesting to see, and I think certainly from the limited amount I've seen of Rodri, he could be quite an exciting player. There's been a couple of people who've likened him to a younger Busquets. I wouldn't know. I've not seen enough of him, but if he's anything like Busquets, then Guardiola will have a lot of fun with him. That's for sure.
Yeah, even a Busquets light would be a nice range to be associated with in terms of playing capacity. So I don't think that it was a bad buy at all. I think it's actually a really intelligent buy, and I think this would be the feeling that most Chelsea fans would have, is that we have seen the way that City has spent their money, even though it's a lot over the past 3, 4, 5 seasons, and there's not really a acquisition that I look at and I'm like, that was either a bad gamble or they didn't spend that money appropriately. And we looked at, over the same time, some of the players that we've brought in, like Daniel Drinkwater or others who constantly get brought up for the price that we paid for them. It seems like City has been extremely good at spending smart over the past 3 to 4 seasons. Do you feel like that's the accurate assessment? Are there any signings that maybe you were unhappy with that you feel still haven't panned out?
I wouldn't. The only one that you'd kind of say hasn't really worked has been Danilo. But he's come in and he's come in as a kind of utility fullback. He's someone who can deputise at left back or right back or maybe hold in midfield, and there just hasn't really been that much of a call for him to do that. So it's not really his fault that it hasn't worked out. It's not really City's fault or Guardiola's fault. It's not really. There's no real blame on any of it. He's one of the. I think he's probably the only player in the squad who you would say, if he were to leave this summer, I don't think many City fans would be that upset to see him go. I think you're right on how City have spent recently. I mean, you only have to look at Manchester United for the example of how not to do it. They've gone out and you look at United's squad. They've bought a string of really, really good Premier League players, but they just can't get them to play together, and they can't get them to there's no kind of cohesive system. And you look at what City have got. I mean, first off, United's model of Ed Woodward and the manager getting together to buy the players, it just doesn't work if you're going to chop and change your manager. City, if City were to lose Guardiola at the end of this season, which they're not likely to do, he's likely to see out his remaining 2 years on his contract extension. But if they were, for instance, they've got a director of football who is building everything towards the same style of play. And so whichever manager comes in, his job or her job would be to get the best out of the players that they've got there available. And that's it. So I think when it comes to recruitment, City have been building this model for some time. There were question marks over the recruitment when Pellegrini was in charge. I think there were a string of signings that were made during the Pellegrini era that just didn't work out. The cynic in me would say that was largely because City didn't want to spend a huge ton of cash because they knew that Guardiola was coming 3 years down the line, and there's no point in ripping everything up, starting again, and then doing it again 3 years later when the person who you have built this post takeover club to accommodate, absolutely everything at City is built up for Guardiola to be there. That there's no reason to kind of invest in things before that and then have to spend a lot of money fixing the problems that you've created by spending that money in the first place. So I think that would be the cynic in me would say why there were so many wrong transfers during Pellegrini's time and why suddenly it's gone so right in recent years.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. And there's so let's kind of go down this path though. So when you take a look at where Chelsea are today, there's a couple of talking points that I think we could get into. Obviously, we win the Europa League, we finished third place. So in terms of success for the season, we got a trophy, we get back in the Champions League. Both ways we could have. What are your thoughts about the leaving Mauricio Sarri and then the appointment of Frank Lampard from a City perspective?
I don't know. I think it's a very dangerous strategy to just throw Lampard in there. I know he's had a few years at Derby and he's done pretty well there. But it works sometimes. It doesn't work all the time. And I'm interested to see what Lampard will change from Sarri. I felt a little bit for Sarri because his Napoli team City faced in the Champions League, not last season before. And they were the two best games that City played that season. There were two real ding-dong battles where both teams were trying to get the ball down and play football. They were both trying to work the space and cause all sorts of problems. And I think you were starting to see that from Sarri's Chelsea last season. But it always felt like an appointment that Abramovich was never going to give it the time that it needed to work. I think so. You look at Guardiola's first season at City, it was an absolute write-off. And a large part of that was because he had so much coaching to do to get into the players, where they needed to move, what they needed to do when they had the ball, and this, that and the other. And you started to see that pay off for City at the end of the 16-17 season. The last kind of 5 or 6 games, they were really starting to play, how they would go on to play for the last 2 seasons. And I think if Sarri had been given a lot more time at Chelsea, I think he could have worked something a lot more like his Napoli side. But then it always felt like he was on the verge of falling out with the Chelsea board, and the board were on the verge of falling out with him. And it just seemed a real shame that he's ended up having to move to Juventus so quickly. Then again, on the flip side, I find his appointment at Juventus a bit of a weird one because it doesn't really fit with what they're going to do either. So I don't know. I think Chelsea's model in recent years, I think. Everything about it screams that it shouldn't work. You shouldn't be able to have such a high turnover of managers and win the league every couple of years and win a trophy here and there. But you have done, and you look at Antonio Conte, Jose Mourinho. They've won good titles at Chelsea, and it just it doesn't make any sense that you should then rip all that up, start again, and then go on and win the league. I don't know how it works. So maybe we're sitting here with Lampard to pop up with a 99-point season and to go on and win the title. Who knows? But it's certainly a model that shouldn't work, and that it does baffles me from season to season. I am interested to see how Lampard does. He's one of my favourite. Before he joined City, he was one of my favourite non-City players. He then had a year at City and caused all sorts of controversy with New York City by pretending that he'd signed there permanently and was at City on loan when he hadn't done. He'd just signed permanently for City for a season. There was all sorts of fun and games around that, and it was just really mischievous. And I loved what his final season in the Premier League was with City. He was nothing like the player that Chelsea had, but he was great for City. He did a job for City for a season, and I'll always respect that.
Yeah, one thing you can count on with Frank is that he will get the job done. Maybe not at the same level as his obviously highest goal scorer for Chelsea and one of the top goal scorers in the entire Premier League. But yeah, the goal against us was one of those terror moments that you want to scrub out of your mind and forget it ever happened.
It was always going to happen, wasn't it? That was the thing. I know I didn't understand why in the game at the Bridge we didn't bring him on sooner, because I just thought if there's one person that's going to win this game for City, it's got to be Lampard from the edge of the box, hasn't it? Because
yes.
It's the law of football. Returning players always score. So
well, it's great. Well, so another thing, so we know that Chelsea are kind of within their transfer ban right now, the registration ban, so they're not bringing in any new players. I think we've been excited to see someone like Phil Foden get opportunities at City last season. See some of the City academy start to get their due, and now we're potentially get this chance with Chelsea's academy to get some recognition. We've seen players like Ruben Loftus-Cheek, earn basically a first-team starting position, a contract extension this past season. Mason Mount has signed a new extension. Obviously, Callum Hudson-Odoi and Tammy Abraham are probably within those ranks as well. Is there anyone that maybe you've heard of or you've seen in the England youth sides that you're interested to see if they can cement themselves in this perfect storm of opportunity when Chelsea can't bring in outside reinforcements and actually have to look inward?
The two that I'm not going to surprise you here, but the two that I really like are both the lads with the double-barreled name, Hudson-Odoi and Loftus-Cheek. I think certainly Loftus-Cheek is someone who I think has great potential. One thing I would kind of urge caution against is the idea that the transfer ban will be a positive thing in that it will force these players to get minutes and that will help them. One thing that I've liked about Foden and City in the last season was that he wasn't, unless the game was right for him, he wasn't thrown in, and he got a lot more playing time than a lot of people seem to realise that he did. He came off the bench a fair number of times. And then towards the end of the season, he started the odd high-pressure game. And that was kind of Guardiola's moment of faith in him to say, look, I trust you to go out there and get the job done. So go out there and get the job done. If City had been in a position where they had to play him, I'm not convinced he would have put the performances in that he did do. So I think, there is certainly going to be great opportunity for Chelsea's youth players in this instance. I don't know... I'm not necessarily convinced it will be a great thing. Hey, I might be completely wrong about that, and especially the players I've mentioned could turn around and put in some wonderful performances, and no doubt do it against City and win the games to really put some egg on my face. But I just think there has to be caution about that. I think Chelsea are going to be very, very smart what they do next season. Because you want to be able to give these players time in the first team, but also you don't want to put too much pressure on them. So it'll be interesting to see what Lampard does. I mean, Lampard, by all accounts, is a pretty good man manager, so he should at least have that side of the game as kind of to a T.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think the other player that we mention as being the American Chelsea podcast, is the arrival of Christian Pulisic to the Premier League. I obviously have only seen just a little bit of him in a Chelsea shirt, mostly photo shoots up until this point, and 20 plus minutes in a friendly in Japan. Do you have any thoughts, any feelings about this type of signing? Are you one of the people who thinks that it's one of those signings that is really more of a commercial piece, or do you feel like there's a talented individual that and Chelsea may have tried to buy in early at the high price that just the market is pushing all these players up to at the moment?
I think he's certainly very exciting. I've not seen an awful lot of him, so I think you guys as Americans will be better placed than I will to kind of comment on his ability. But from what I've seen, he's certainly very exciting, and I think he's the sort of player that I might have seen at City in this kind of City fold, but not as the next club, if you know what I mean. It might be that he had a transfer somewhere else and then City went out and spent big on him after that. So maybe like from if City ever do transfers from Chelsea, which they're both on that kind of footing now where they won't sell to each other. But that sort of deal, I think Chelsea have been quite smart in getting in there quite early in that sense. But he may just need some time. I don't know. That
is fair. Yeah, I don't necessarily know if he'll be starting the season, but definitely think he's in contention to play 25 games maybe this season fully and get an opportunity to contribute, especially as some of our other wingers like Pedro and Willian maybe kind of tamper down to the end of their time at Chelsea, or being the kind of heavy contributors that they have been in previous seasons.
Yeah.
The other thing that you mentioned, and I think City fans feel aggrieved when they look at UEFA and FIFA. Chelsea fans also feel potentially times aggrieved about UEFA and FIFA. Obviously, we're dealing with the registration ban. You mentioned earlier, and I kind of wanted to bring this back up, about the financial fair play issues, which is something that, I think Chelsea, at a club at certain times was probably one of those clubs that was thought about in the creation of rules like financial fair play, and have tried to run that bounce book scenario, one in, one out. Really have made a lot more money on player sales over the past couple seasons than we have, especially losing out on some European competition in a couple of seasons. How do you feel about the financial fair play situation? How do you feel about I think what most people say, singling out of City, at least in the modern era, especially when you also look at like PSG spending like a nation state and not receiving some of the same kind of critical eye?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I would say before I say any of this is that one thing that your listeners need to be aware of is, of course I would say this.
I don't think it's going to surprise anybody.
I think financial fair play is a terrible idea. It's worked on. It has worked in that it has stopped clubs spending beyond their means and going out of business. But what the side effect of that has been to ensure that the clubs that make the most money traditionally will stay in that position of holding the power in especially in Europe. Largely because nobody can ever spend the money that they spend, because nobody can ever get to that level to earn the money that they earn. So there comes a position where City, in a way, got quite lucky with financial fair play, because when it came in, the drawbridge was being pulled up and City kind of clambered over the top of it and fell down the other side, and are in a position where they can build on everything that they've got at the minute, start to build commercial revenue, and have a seat at the top table based on the money that they spent just before it came in. You take I've got plenty of fans that I've got friends that are fans of other clubs, and every single one of them at the time when financial fair play was coming in was talking about, oh, this is a great thing because it means that clubs can't buy their way to the top. And then I kind of looked at them and went, why is that such a good thing? Because, you're an Aston Villa fan. When are you going to get to see Aston Villa in a Champions League final now? And the answer is, well, you're not. So I think that's the problem that's the big problem that I have with financial fair play. Listen, I grew up as a City fan in the 90s, and I spent season after season after season listening to United fans telling me how much better than City they were. talking about, how City were a rubbish club and could never do anything, could never achieve anything, would never win anything again. I got to a point in about 2006 where City got knocked out of the FA Cup to Blackburn in a horrid game at Ewood Park. Blackburn had a man sent off after about 10 minutes or something like that, and they still lost to the 10 men. And there was a point where the players were trudging off the pitch and the fans were chanting at them, "You're not fit to wear the shirt." And I sat there, I watched it in the pub at university, and I sat there with my friends, and I had this sudden realisation that was as good as it was ever going to get. City were going to be safe in the Premier League. They were going to finish on 40 points and just get over the line. They might have a cup run to an FA Cup, quarter final or potentially a semi-final, but that might be asking a bit too much. And then we'd do it all again the next season. And I kind of thought, if this is as good as it gets, what's the point, sort of thing? Why am I continually investing my hope into this group of players when nothing is ever going to come of it? And then 2007, they take over by Thaksin Shinawatra. 2008, they take over by Sheikh Mansour. And I have seen things in the last 10 years at City that I never dreamt I would be able to see. I think that should be open to every single football fan on the planet, and I think you should be able to have that position where if a rich owner wants to come in and pump an absolute ton of money into this club, then let them do it. Let them do it. Let them invest in the playing staff and get this football club up to the top of the table. And enjoy watching your football team play great football. And what Financial Fair Play has done is it's stomped on all those hopes and dreams, but it has made sure that every single club is likely going to survive. And then the flip side of all of that is what it's done is that City have looked at it and gone, well, we don't think these rules are particularly fair. We want to continue to sign players, and so then you start getting scrutiny of all the sponsorship deals that City have done, and the classic was the Etihad Stadium naming rights deal, which over 10 years worked out at something like £5 million a year, which on any sort of normal basis you would say, well, that's vastly undervalued. At the time, it seemed like a lot, and at the time, it enabled City to go out and spend 50 million on whoever, but they then start to magic up all these other kind of deals with companies that, when you dig deep enough, you start to wonder, well, are they actually a connection to the owners, and is it just the owner finding a different way to pump money into the club? And City won't be the only team doing these sorts of deals. They've been caught recently with the Football League stuff that came out, and will probably get some sort of punishment, but I don't think the fans will care particularly. I don't think the club will care particularly, and will be, if they get, I don't know, a season out of the Champions League or 2 seasons out of the Champions League, City will go back into it, and then everything will kind of start again. And you just kind of wonder, what is the point of all of this being like this? These rules didn't exist for Manchester United to win all sorts of trophies in the 90s, and they talk like the money that they earned was organic. It was there's very little difference between spending lots of money that you've got by winning competitions and closing the drawbridge behind you, and spending lots of money that a really rich person has given you on basically goodwill. So I don't buy that. I don't buy that sort of, it's better to do it this way or that way, because ultimately there's only one real way to do it. You'll get the odd season where somebody like Leicester comes out of nowhere and wins the title, but more often than not, it will be one of the teams that spends the most money in that season that wins the title every year, and it will be one of the teams that spends the most money that wins the Champions League. So I think financial fair play has had its uses, but was a very, very ill thought out kind of rush piece of legislation that has had a knock-on effect that I don't think anybody I think a few people saw coming at the time, but I don't think their voices were particularly listened to.
Well, and I think the challenge is now is how do you go back and rewrite it? How do you put it in a place and frame it appropriately for the modern era where, again, money just keeps on piling in, and if the money isn't being invested into trying to improve the quality of play, to improve things like some type of fund for match officials to improve, to get VAR right, to just continually enhance the game, to bring up the lower levels of football and grassroots football. Like there's so many better uses for that money than lining pockets of owners.
Oh, exactly, and the money doesn't filter down either. So
Right.
So City make a lot of money. They'll make, if they're out of the Champions League for 2 seasons, they'll still make a lot of money, but none of that's going to filter down to the lower leagues of football. So that's the problem. That's what financial fair play needs to solve. It doesn't need to stop clubs spending a ton of money to get into the Champions League, and I think that's we kind of lost sight of what it should be. And I think all the clubs that voted for it now, I think those that weren't already at the top table didn't realise what they were voting for, and I think those that were at the top table, again, call me cynical, and I think of which City were probably one at the time, would say. This will keep us in the position we want to be in, and I think City at the time spotted that they had to. I think Gary Cook, the former chief exec, said a few years ago, we didn't want to spend that much money that quickly. We wanted to be a much slower development. But when we saw financial fair play was on the horizon, we knew we needed to get in there before the door shut. And look where we are now. The door is well and truly shut, and nobody's getting in, are they?
Not at this present moment, though. I'm sure with the continually rising rights distribution and how that works, that some team, I think like Wolves right now is a good example of a team that's finding a way to spend smart and has risen up pretty quickly over the past couple seasons and has the same type of ownership mentality that they don't just want to win the Premier League. They would like to go and be competitive in the Champions League. So I think it takes a unified approach in the way that we've seen before, at Chelsea, now at City, now what we're seeing, at Wolves. It has to be a top-down approach to taking that money and spending it wisely, not just saying we're going to go buy a bunch of players and hope it all ends up appropriately on the pitch.
Oh yeah, because otherwise you end up you get Manchester United if that's what happens. So yeah.
Oh, I love every moment to dig in. You've taken it today. I really appreciate that. So
you can't not. It's look at the club. It's an absolute shambles. I could do an hour talking about how badly run they are. It's just there's so much wrong with that club. It's so easy. I find it. It would be an insult to your audience if I didn't take these opportunities. That's what I'll say.
Well, I think it's how we feel about Arsenal nowadays, where they've brought in one player and it's almost like they have a registration ban that they force on themselves, and it just almost becomes to the point where is it too easy? Is it really too easy to make fun of them now? Because I kind of feel like it is. So let's look at the season ahead. So we'll kind of start to wind down here. I want to hear your predictions for how City will finish this season. We'll kind of go through a couple of the different tournaments and different trophies up for grabs, maybe a couple of best players, and then where you think Chelsea's going to finish. So league table position, prediction points. Where do you think City ends up this upcoming season?
I want to say first again, I worry about Liverpool. I think having gone close last season and having won the Champions League, they could have the bit between the teeth. I'm kind of hoping that the way they lost the league last season by only losing one game and by having the record points total for second place, I'm hoping that it really does beat them into submission. But I don't see that coming, to be honest with you. I think Liverpool and City are your top two. I would hope City are your top one, but if it's Liverpool, then they're going to have to go some to do it, because I think City are going to get in the region of 98, 99, 100 points again. I don't see too many teams taking points off City this coming season.
Well, I really hope that the Liverpool scenario does not come to fruition. I think you had a bunch of Chelsea supporters who were closeted City fans for the last couple matches of the season, with our fingers crossed, and realizing that Liverpool at least had won the Champions League previously, so that was a lesser evil than watching Tottenham win, and then watching City win is much better than watching Liverpool win the league, because how obnoxious would that have been if they had won both? That just would have been, the end of days would clearly have been upon us.
Yeah, I didn't fancy it. The thing is, and I know we shouldn't take social media at face value, but social media had amplified the absolute lunatics that were following Liverpool. And basically, it was the lunatic City fans were pushing the lunatic Liverpool fans into my Twitter feed, and so all of a sudden I found I was hating everything to do with Liverpool. And I was thinking, this is not healthy. This is just not healthy. Just focus on City, and if they don't do it, then go into hiding for a couple of months, and that's it. I think there was a point towards the end of last season where I can tell you where it was, because it was me and my partner had gone out for food with a friend of ours and his colleague from work, and his colleague was a Southampton fan, and it was a Friday night because it was Friday night football. Liverpool had gone to Southampton, and Southampton took the lead, and I couldn't tell you anything that was going on at that meal, because I was so invested in this Liverpool game that I wasn't even watching. And it was on that night that I realised that all season, normally you just play 38 Premier League games. Last season, I must have suffered through. It must have got to about 60, because when it emerged that Liverpool were going to be City's title challengers, you end up watching every one of their games and supporting the opposition, and it absolutely kills you. The moment when they pull it back with a deflection or a goalkeeper error, that sort of thing. And City did it as well, so I'm fairly sure Liverpool fans felt the same way, the other way around. But it's absolutely crushing, and I've promised myself that I'm not going to get that invested next season.
Oh, I wish you well in your attempt to not get caught up, but it sounds
absolutely
like to me
not going to happen.
It's going to happen. All right, so FA Cup, League Cup, won both last season. Do you see yourself winning 0-1 or both of those again this season?
Honestly, I don't think they'll win both again. I think it would be extraordinary if City were to pull off a domestic treble 2 seasons running. My hunch should be the FA Cup that they don't take. The flip side of it as well, for all of what City achieved last season, we have to acknowledge that they got lucky when they needed to get lucky. There was a point in when would it have been, January, February time, when the League Cup semi-finals came around. They could have drawn Arsenal, they could have drawn Tottenham, they drew Burton Albion, and I don't want to disrespect Burton Albion, but Nigel Clough and his team treated it like they were out already, and City didn't even need to get out a neutral in the car to go on and win those games. If they'd drawn Tottenham or Arsenal, they would have had 2 tough ties over both legs. And so there were points in both of the cup runs where they got a really good draw and they dealt with it. You look at the Swansea game in the FA Cup. By all accounts, City were second best on the day. They got lucky with a penalty that wasn't a penalty, and then Aguero scored an offside goal at the end, which had it been on any other ground with VAR, it would have been ruled out and the game would have gone to extra time. Except It wouldn't, because the penalty wouldn't have been given because Sterling tripped himself up. He wasn't tripped. So there's so many of those moments in the cup runs that in Premier League football you kind of write off and say, well, it balances out over the course of a season and teams get lucky and unlucky in various points. In cup football, you get lucky in 3 games and suddenly you're in a quarter-final or semi-final. So there's as much as City's achievement was fantastic, there were elements along the way where they had their moments of good fortune, and I don't foresee that happening again every season that comes along. There'll be points where City don't. Next season in the FA Cup, they could again get drawn away at Wigan and not turn up, and then Wigan pull another number on City and knock them out of the competition again. So I don't ever kind of count chickens when it comes to the knockout competitions. What I would say is the number of times City have won the League Cup in recent years, we kind of assume that City win it until they're told otherwise now, because Guardiola. You look at the teams that the top sides put out. Most of them rotate the team, and then Guardiola puts out a full strength 11 except for his goalkeeper, and you kind of wonder, well, okay, he takes every game seriously, doesn't he? So if everybody else rotates and City don't, they have a pretty good chance of winning the competition. So I'll rather hesitantly say one cup, and I think it'll be the League Cup.
All right. So then I know we talked about how there's an apathy towards the Champions League, but any thoughts on? It sounds like you feel like you might not win it, but maybe where what round do you go out in, and or do you? Is this the year that City goes and makes the Champions League a thing?
Bluntly, no, it isn't. I don't see them winning the Champions League anytime soon. I think they They've got the squad, they've got the players, they've got the manager to do it. For one reason or another, they just don't do it. I think last season was a bit weird. I mean, we take Guardiola's last 2 seasons, for instance. They got drawn up against Liverpool in 17-18, and Liverpool are the perfect team to knock City out of a cup competition. They play such quick attacking football that City were 3-0 down before they'd realised what was going on. And again, City fans will point to some bad decisions in that game. First goal from Salah was offside. City should have had a penalty in front of the Kop in the second half. They had a perfectly good away goal ruled out in the game at Anfield. So there were moments that went against City, but overall, over the 2 legs of the tie, Liverpool were by far and away the better team and deserved to go through. Flip that round to Tottenham. Guardiola kind of learnt his lesson in the first leg for that game. It was the first leg of that Champions League tie was in a run where City had to win every single league game in order to win the title. They had to win every single FA Cup game in order to win the FA Cup, and they did both of those things. In the Champions League, they had leeway in one game, and that was the away tie at Tottenham. And Guardiola took that leeway. He didn't play. I don't think he played Sane. I don't think he played De Bruyne, who was fit at the time. And it just City lacked a little bit of intensity. And what it looked like they were doing was going, we'll keep Tottenham at arm's length. If we're still in the tie by the time the second leg comes around, what we'll do in the second leg is organised chaos, and we'll just make everything go mental. And they did that, and it ended up with them being a whisker away from qualifying with a last minute goal. You would question whether it was wise to allow Tottenham to score 3 times at the Etihad when you're trying to get through in a competition that has away goals. I would argue it probably isn't. But again, there were 2 very different contrasting styles, and you can see why Guardiola did what he did. I don't think he's quite kind of cracked it with City in that regard. But hey, I'm not going to rule out the fact that they could get to the Champions League final by drawing the easiest team that they could draw in every round. So they need a bit of luck with the draw. At some point, they're going to play a team that's really good at knockout football. And I think City are much more suited to league football than they are knockout football. And I think that's one of their biggest issues with the Champions League.
Sure. So then last question, and then we'll wrap up for today. But where do you think Chelsea finish in this upcoming season?
I don't know. I really worry about Chelsea with the loss of Eden Hazard. We do too. Yeah, I absolutely I loved him as a player at Chelsea, and I'm not going to lie, I was gutted when he picked Chelsea over City in 2012, it would have been, because I could have seen him doing wonderful things for City instead. So I think he's a huge loss. There's no getting around it. I don't think Chelsea are top 2 material. I think City and Liverpool are streets ahead of the rest of the league. Beyond that, it really does depend how quickly Lampard settles in. I think Tottenham will probably grab 3rd place. I think Chelsea are better than United because there are so many teams that are better than United. I think they're better than Arsenal, and I think it all kind of depends. And by definition, they're better than the rest of the league because it is 6 and then everybody else. So I would expect Chelsea to be pushing for 4th place. Maybe with a few pieces of good fortune and a little bit of bad fortune for the others, maybe might sneak 3rd, but also wouldn't be too surprised to see them miss out on the Champions League, finishing 5th.
All right,
they'll finish above Arsenal, I think. Anyway,
I think that we probably could go place a bet on that and be pretty secure that we could spend the winnings in advance, and I think we wouldn't be in a bad shape. Well, David, really an amazing pleasure to chat with you today. Again, he's at David Mooney on Twitter. He hosts the Blue Moon Podcast at Blue Moon Podcast. So if you want to learn more about City, you want to do a little bit of that opposition research throughout the season. They also just did a great one episodic one shot around the 1999 second division playoff final at Wembley. That was exceptional. So even if you're not a City supporter, it was really great to listen to. But David, thank you so much. And I would say best of luck, but I'm just going to say good luck to this upcoming season because I think you already have all the talent in the world to not need as much luck this year.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. All right, Chelsea fans. So that is a wrap on our Manchester City preview of the 2019-2020 Premier League season. We have a bunch more coming your way to take a look at the other top teams in the league and a few others that might surprise you. So stay tuned for those. But until next time, you know what to do. Keep the blue flag flying high.